A man gave people three empty jars. No tricks, no hidden tools, just three jars with different capacities. Then he asked them to measure one exact amount of water. Most people solved it. But that was the problem, because the experiment was never about whether they could find the answer. It was about whether the answer they found would trap them. The man was Abraham Lutyens, and in 1942 he discovered one of the strangest failures of the human mind. A failure that does not happen because you know too little. It happens because you know too much. He called it Einstellung, a German word that means something like a setting, an attitude, a mind locked into position. Today, psychologists call it the Einstellung effect, but it has a simpler name, the first answer effect, because sometimes the most dangerous answer is not the wrong one, it is the first right one. The setup looked harmless. Participants were shown three jars: jar A, jar B, jar C. Each could hold a different amount of water. Their job was to use those jars to measure one specific number. At first, the solution was strange. Fill the big jar, pour some into the smaller jar, pour some into the tiny jar, then pour again. It was clumsy. It was annoying. But it worked. And then it worked again. And again. And again. By the time the participants reached the later problems, something had changed. They were no longer solving the problem in front of them. They were repeating the problem behind them. Then Lutyens quietly changed the test. He gave them a new problem that had a much simpler answer. No complicated pouring, no strange formula, no mental gymnastics. Just fill one jar and add another. The simple answer was sitting right there, visible, available, almost embarrassingly obvious. And many people missed it, not because they were stupid, because the old solution still worked. They had found a path through the maze. So when a door opened beside them, they kept walking through the maze. That is the Einstellung effect. A useful pattern becomes a mental prison, and the more successful the pattern was, the harder the prison becomes to see. That is what makes the effect so unsettling. Failure warns you. Failure tells you that something is wrong. Success does the opposite. Success whispers, keep doing this. So the mind obeys. It turns a solution into a habit. Then, it turns the habit into the only thing you can see. Lutyens called this mechanization, a state where thinking starts to behave like a machine. Input, pattern, output, input, pattern, output. The person is still conscious, still working, still trying, but part of the mind has already stopped looking. That would be disturbing enough if it only happened to ordinary people doing water puzzles. But decades later, researchers found it somewhere much worse. They found it in experts. A group of scientists gave chess players a board position. On the board was a very familiar situation. A good move. A move any trained player would recognize. But hidden somewhere else on the same board was a better move. A cleaner move. A move that won faster. The experts said they were looking for it, and they believed they were. But their eyes told a different story. Eye tracking cameras watched them where they looked. Again and again, their eyes returned to the familiar solution. The good move had captured their attention. And because it was good, the better move became almost invisible. That's the cruel part. The brain does not need a bad idea to mislead you. A good idea can do it better. A bad idea creates resistance. A good idea creates trust. And once the mind trusts an answer, it stops interrogating it. This is why the Einstellung effect is not just a laboratory trick. It is everywhere humans are rewarded for being fast. A doctor sees a familiar cluster of symptoms. A programmer recognizes a familiar bug. A designer reaches for a layout that worked last time. A founder copies the strategy that saved the last company. A person enters the same relationship with a different face. The old solution appears. It feels like intelligence. It feels like experience. It feels like intuition. And sometimes it is. But sometimes intuition is just a memory wearing a mask. The brain loves old answers because old answers are cheap. They save energy. They reduce uncertainty. They make the world feel familiar. And most of the time, that is useful. You do not want to relearn how to open a door every morning. You don't want to rethink every step of tying your shoes. Habit is not the enemy. Habit is one of the reasons that you survive. The danger starts when habit moves into places where thought was supposed to live. Because a habit does not ask whether the world has changed. A habit only asks whether this looks close enough to the last time, and if it does, the habit takes over. That is how people become trapped by their own competence. The beginner fails because he cannot see the pattern. The expert, though, he fails because he cannot stop seeing it. This is the part that almost nobody tells you about expertise. Expertise gives you shortcuts, but every shortcut is also a blind spot. The same knowledge that helps you move faster can make you turn too early. The same experience that lets you recognize the answer can actually prevent you from noticing that the question changed. And the modern world makes this worse. Because everything now rewards speed. Answer faster, post faster, ship faster, decide faster. Be the first one with a take. Be the first one with a solution. Be the first one who sounds certain. But certainty is exactly where the trap begins. The moment an answer arrives too quickly, it starts to feel like truth. And once it feels like truth, every other possibility becomes harder to see. The mind does not announce this when it happens. It does not say, I am now ignoring better options. It simply gives you a clean answer, a familiar answer, an answer that has worked before. And because it feels useful, you call it thinking. But sometimes it's actually not thinking, it's just remembering. The way out is not to destroy habit because you cannot live without it. The way out is to become less suspicious of the first answer that feels too comfortable. To ask one extra question before you move. What would I try if this solution had never worked for me before? What would a beginner see here? What am I not looking at because I already found something that works? That question is small, but it interrupts the machine. It gives the mind one moment to become human again. Lutyens did not prove that people are irrational. He proved something stranger, that people can be perfectly rational inside the wrong frame. They can solve the problem correctly and still miss the point. They can win the old game while losing the new one. And that is why the first answer is so dangerous. Not because it is always wrong, but because it is often right enough. Right enough to stop the search. Right enough to quiet doubt. Right enough to make the better answer disappear. The water jars were never really about the water. The chessboards were never really about chess. They were about the moment a tool becomes a cage. The moment your experience stops serving you and starts steering you. The moment the mind says, I've seen this before. And because it has seen something like it, it stops seeing what is actually there. You do not beat the Einstellung effect by being smarter. Smart people fall into it constantly. You beat it by noticing when your own confidence arrives too early. Because the first answer may solve the problem, but the second answer is where thinking begins. And sometimes, the thing blocking the door is not ignorance. It is the key you are already holding.